Hi there, my name is Marty Owings. Thanks for stopping by today. Today I'd like to talk a little bit about the differences between acrylic gouache, which is a non-traditional gouache, and traditional gouache, which is the gouache that most professional artists and others are used to using. I'll take a look at both the properties and how these different gouaches compare and how they're used. And I'll try to compare as closely in color as I have in my selection here. So I have the Holbein and the acrylic gouache, and I have a mix of brands, a couple of Holbein, a couple of different other types of gouache. But really the purpose here is just to compare the different properties and to kind of talk through that a little bit today. I think it's worth starting off talking a little bit about what gouache is. Gouache in general is a water-based medium. In other words, it's water mixable, and that holds true for both acrylic and traditional gouache. On the other hand, acrylic has some unique properties that traditional gouache doesn't have, and vice versa. So if you're going to use acrylic-based gouache, here's the major difference. Once it's dry, it really isn't rewettable. It's just like putting a little plastic coat of paint on, and you're not going to be able to re-wet that very easily, or if at all. On the swatches I drew here, I let the blue paint in the acrylic version didn't dry quite the same. So it wasn't quite dry when I tried the wet reactivation test on it. But here I'm going to take a brush, a very wet brush, and I'm going to run it across the acrylic yellow. And you're going to see that I'm not able to drag down any color from that yellow, really, at all. And nor from the red or the green or the orange or the white. But here when I drag it down on the traditional gouache, you can see it's picking up some of that color because you can re-wet traditional gouache. It can be reactivated. It's got different the pigment might be the same, but the binders are different. And I think it comes down to the particles of the pigment being larger and the ratio of pigment to the binder being higher. Not sure on all the science behind that, but hey, I know how it works in a practical sense. And whereas traditional gouache, as you can see, is really rewettable here and reactivatable, most of the time this acrylic stuff is not going to be, almost 100% of the time. Now I left this blue swatch was still a little wet, so I was able to drag down a little color. But otherwise you're not going to be able to do that at all. It dries like plastic, and no matter how much I try to scrub it, it's really not picking up any of that color. Now, what's another difference between acrylic gouache and traditional gouache? Well, with acrylic gouache, you can really lay it on thick, like an impasto effect. And you can really get a lot of texture built up. Because it's acrylic, it's not going to crack when it dries, whereas traditional gouache will have a tendency to crack if you apply it too thickly. But you know, here again, and I'm just putting it to the test, painting some things with it today. But if you wanted to use a paint that wasn't going to crack but wasn't acrylic, you'd probably have to turn to like a casein or something like that. And when casein dries, it is hard to lift as well, so that's a nice property of that particular paint. But again, it's totally in the artist's preference, whatever you decide to use. Now here, I'm just mixing colors, and it's true that you can mix acrylic gouache with regular gouache. You could even mix acrylic gouache, I think, with watercolor. I haven't actually applied that to a painting myself, but in tests, yeah, you can do it. And the real question is, what would you do that for? How would you use that? Well, I'm sure somebody can think of some way, but the point is that you can mix all of these water-based mediums up if you want. You could do whatever you want. Try it out. Give it a shot. It'll work. What about the acrylic gouache? I'm using Holbein today, which is a nice gouache, really nice in both the traditional gouache and the acrylic-based gouache. In the acrylic gouache, they offer like 107 colors, and you can get those in either 20 milliliter or 40 milliliter tubes. And it reacts and blends and feels like traditional gum Arabic gouache, but it isn't, right? Because of all the properties I mentioned, but most especially it's water resistant, almost waterproof once it's dry. And it doesn't shift in color tone from liquid to dry color. So what you see in liquid, you get in the dry paint as well. I think what's really cool is that you have all these options today with gouache that maybe you didn't have years ago. you'd have to use maybe a traditional acrylic paint, whereas now you've got this acrylic gouache, which has a lot of the properties of traditional gouache, but doesn't lift. So you can get a lot of backgrounds and different effects with that type of gouache, and it won't lift. The color won't lift. So that's great. And this has been a comparison between regular traditional gouache and acrylic gouache, but I encourage you to experiment yourself. Drop me a note. Thanks for stopping by today. Hope you have a great week. Bye-bye.